So it seems to me that this text is somewhat of a coda, somewhat of an epilogue. In fact, if you look at the text for this week, there's a couple of different ones. There's this one, then there's the fishing trip where the disciples are out fishing in the boat and Jesus appears there. One that happens every third year is the road to Emmaus, the disciples walking back into their hometown to Emmaus, and Jesus appears among them. We have all these sort of last minute, they're almost like afterthoughts. And while on the one hand they seem to be sort of an apologetic, the writer's sort of attempts to give witness to Jesus in the physical form after his resurrection, there's also sort of this sense of just kind of wraps it up. I mean, certainly Jesus, with the disciples early on, had said, here's the most important things. You know, this is the most important law, that you love the Lord your God with all your heart. When you see the Samaritan story, it's like, go and do likewise. There's certainly plenty of times in which Jesus has said, go and do this. Do as I do. But it seems like here's just one more chance to kind of wrap it up. Which, on the one hand, is a very profound thing. And on the other hand, for me, is kind of like an anticlimax. Here we had Easter, which is this amazing, unbelievable experience, not just to mention the message. No matter how you look at the story of the Easter story, it's an impressive, overwhelmingly amazing message. Life triumphs over death. God triumphs over darkness. And then you have, we were having supper, and Jesus came by and showed us his side and his hands again. Thomas shows up and said, no, I don't believe. I mean, it just seems sort of like a letdown. It just doesn't seem to have that energy, that same quality. And then he says the obvious. I remember when I was Pentecostal, and I was Episcopal, and I had been in a number of different denominations, but I did enjoy a stint of time with the Pentecostals and remember speaking in tongues. Now, of course, later on, I pretty much decided that was my adaptation of Spanish and what little Latin I knew, and the emotion of being in the room with 100 other people crammed into a small space and going like, yeah, I can do this too, you know. But what was always so disappointing to me, and I'm a critic, I'm the ultimate critic. My wife will call me the creative irritant. I mean, I will see the dark side before I see the light side, and if you don't, I'll help you see it first too. And I'm sitting in there listening to people speak in tongues, and then the interpreter comes up and says, God wants you to know that you are loved. And I'm going, really? All of that? For that message? Is there any way to say duh in tongues? You know, God wants you to know that he is present in the world. And it's sort of like, well, yeah, no, do we really need all of this for that purpose? It's kind of like an anticlimax. It's a letdown. So I started thinking about, okay, well, is that what this story is about then? Is this story just to say, well, here's Thomas. If he didn't believe it, and now he does, you can believe it too. Is it just an apologetic, or is there something else? And, of course, it comes around every year, these stories. So I thought, well, maybe there's another way to look at it. And that's what I remember Frederick Buechner saying. Frederick Buechner, a writer and theologian and philosopher in his own right. And he had said that seeing God, that experiencing God is somewhat like being in a window, looking out the window, and you see a bunch of people pointing. And there's an awning that's covering, so you can't really see what they're pointing to, but by the enthusiasm on their face, by the expressions in their pointing, you're overwhelmed with this sense of, I want to be a part of that. But you never really see it specifically. You see it in one another. So maybe the message with this story is more about how do we witness to life? What is it about our stories that testifies to life, that is a witness to life? Now, I started thinking about this because a couple of things. For one thing, my father-in-law passed away right about this time, and every year, one of our sons who's in town, our oldest one, and sometimes Linda, although she'll probably do this next week herself, but we'll go to Greenwood Cemetery. And I don't know if you do that. Some people think it's kind of morbid to go hang out at cemeteries. And I sometimes go not just to see family on the anniversary of their passing, but sometimes because it's weird. It's a nice way of sort of reminding yourself, I think, sometimes, of what life is and what life should be. And the more you go looking around, then I think you really do begin to see some interesting things. How many of you ever saw or read Nikos Kazantzaki's book, Zorba the Greek? Did anybody ever read that book in here? It's an amazing book. and now I'm going to forget the guy's name, Bayless. I don't think that's the right name, but he's the writer and businessman who sort of comes over to Crete, where he meets Zorba, and Zorba's this live life to the fullest kind of character. And when one of his good friends has died, he goes and he tells the American, we need to dance on death. We need to dance on the grave. So these vivid images of him always going to the cemetery and dancing on friends' graves. And I think about that every time I go to a cemetery. I think, well, are these testimonies to life, or is this testimony to death? And then I wonder, well, are our lives testimonies to life, or in fact, have we really been dead for a while and we're just kind of living it out? Just kind of biding time. Certainly that's true for a lot of folks. But if you go around and you look at the headstones, it's really cool, because then you get a sense of those folks who sort of tried to buck the system, buck the norm, So you see the obvious one, which you see a lot of places. People just copy this one. But the one that says, "I told them I was sick." I mean, you see people with efforts, really making an effort. If you're going to come see what I'm, my thing, then at least enjoy it, have a little fun with it. And I kid you not far from where my Snyder family, my grandparents were Snyders, and not far from where their whole family plot is, there's one down the hill off to the, I'm going to say the northeastern sort of portion where it's a little more open field. But there's a headstone there, and it's large, and it's got a concrete area with two concrete cup holders in it. And the couple of times I've been by there, I'd say about 50% of the time, there's always a beer. I'm not kidding. There's always a beer. I mean, it's not always a good beer, but it's always a beer, Once it was a Shiner, and Linda and I were actually there. We were driving around looking at family, and it was a Shiner, and I'll confess, I drank it. But it says on the deal, it said, "Celebrate life and have one on me." And I thought, well, if it weren't for the fact that I'm an ordained minister, I might just go ahead and do that, but I'm not sure if I could get in trouble afterwards. But, traveling around, you see all of these amazing ones. So I went online and I started thinking about some different ones. So I'm gonna give you some inspiration here. Of course, my father-in-law he's German. He was born in southeast Texas, German Texas, and he was an engineer. And pretty much, you live, you die, you live faithfully, you die, it's done. And so it was just loving husband, faithful husband, loving father, and then had the dates, and then it said Marvin Kermit Fox. And I love that, though, because he kept the Kermit. Because I swore that we would name our first child Kermit. And so at least I get to, because it'd be Kermit McDermott. I thought that would be cool. And I tried to get my son to name his, but now he's got a daughter. That wouldn't work, So, but it's he used to tell us, again, I laugh because he used to say, that used to be such a great name before the frog came along. It's a good German name. But if you look around, you see all these wonderful phrases. So I got online, and I'll give you a few of these. Rodney Dangerfield, y'all remember him, the comedian? On his it says, "There goes the neighborhood." Which I thought was pretty funny. And then the Merv Griffin, who was the TV host and whatnot, it says, "I will not be right back after the message." My mother-in-law says that the one she wants is one she saw in Australia years ago when they were doing marking, with the charcoal and stuff, and they toured around Australia, and it said she did the best she could. And I thought, well, now that's more of an honest sort of appraisal. And it's sort of a classic Midwestern kind of appraisal, too, which is where she's from the Midwest. And it reminded me that our testimonies, our witness, our life that we live out is so much a pattern of who we are and who we've been, but not just that, also a pattern of who our people were, of who our cultures were as wherever we grew up. There's a sentiment that is ingrained in us. And in fact, there's science behind this. The neural networks that form in our brains, they form behaviorally, they form socially by the context in which we grow up and by the patterns that we live out. And so, for me, one of the best one of the best things to have put on my tombstone would be something that Henry Miller said. When he said, the destination of life is not a place, but is a new way of seeing things. The destination of life is not a place, but is a new way of seeing things. As if to say, every destination is always a new way of seeing things. And I'm wondering if that's not maybe what this text is really offering us a chance to think about more. It's not so much that doesn't this prove I've raised from the dead, as much as to say, blessed are those who believe but haven't seen. Perhaps the destination of life, perhaps the understanding of the holy in our midst is not to find that final belief, but to find, or that final place, but is really to always be open to a new way of seeing things. Now, that's really hard for me. And I preach it a lot, and it's like every other time I come here, I tell Charles I can't imagine, I tell my wife too, I mean, I can't imagine having to preach on a regular basis because I hate to be, guilty of not doing what I'm saying we ought to be doing, which I most of the time am. Because the reality is I'm not an optimist. I'm not just the creative irritant, but I am the eternal pessimist. Who said that? I am, yeah. Doxy, on the other hand, is a great example of the opposite of me. We should walk together. That way you get a nice balanced emotional experience. But no, I just happen to be that way. I suffer from what could be termed, and I looked it up, it's not a technical term, but I suffer from something you might call hyperbolic reaction syndrome. So you lose your keys. I didn't just lose them. I don't see them immediately. Somebody stole them. Tom, we've been in the house the whole day. I don't care. Somebody got hold of my keys. My reaction is always to the most extreme. I had a colonoscopy, and I had one of those, and here we are talking colonoscopy in church. Isn't that exciting? Yeah. You don't get that every Sunday, do you? So this happened about 5 years ago, and the doctor calls me in, and it wasn't my normal doctor, and he called me in, and he said, well, I just wanted to let you know something else we found. There's a spot on your pancreas. I went home, I'm a dead man. I mean, I had every potential X-ray you could have, CAT scans, MRIs. I mean, my brother-in-law, who's also a doctor and a very fine internist in town, said, Tom, nobody looks at those things that seriously. Those X-rays show everything. You wouldn't believe how many spots are all over your body. But I happened to get the doctor who was a very pragmatic, very black and white kind of doctor. I won't say his nationality, but he kind of read the thing and he looked at me and he said, you could die from this. He's yeah. And I said, no, really. And he said, and it had nothing to do with his nationality. I just wanted to use a bad attempt at making an accent. I could have said he was Irish and gone, well, now, let us take a look at this and see what it says. So maybe I should have been Irish. But anyway, he looked at it, and he was one of those doctors that I had to go to because mine wasn't in there, and he just gave it to me the black and white, which was a good thing to do. It was an honest thing to do. You really could die from this. He said, if it were me, what I would have you do is I would have you go and have this internal, I can't remember what it's called, this whole internal procedure, and we'll do a biopsy of your pancreas internally. And then he said, now there are risks associated. About 35% develop pancreatic infection as a result of that. But this way, for sure, you would know that it's not a spot. And my brother-in-law, again, is going like, why do they even tell you these things? And I look at him and say, aren't you a doctor? Yeah, but some things you just don't need to know. And I said, well, what if I die? And he had these two extremes. I go to the easiest one for me, which is I'm a dead man already. Now, the reality is that's the case for me in everything, and I work on it really hard. I mean, to try to prevent it, so that I actually do a little stopgap measure, where when I lose the keys, I go, no, the keys are right where no, they're not, and then I fall back into it. But there's a science behind this. As I mentioned, the neural networks get established, so we're fighting something already, depending on how our patterns have been established in our brain, which is perhaps why meditation, why prayer is such a powerful tool, because it forces us to stop. It forces us to sit still, to take a stand back, and wait for something else besides the immediate reaction. When I was in Philadelphia about 4 years ago, I was telling stories at a hospital. And I was working with some kids there, and afterwards I went and got my rent car, and I went to an area called South Street. I don't know if you've all been to Philadelphia, but it's kind of like our Magnolia Street here. It's an artsy area, and it's really cool. And parking is not easy to find, so I got there early enough that I found some parking along these beautiful sort of new modern condos, and they were sort of early 20th century design, so they had these street lamps that were really interesting and fun, and I pulled in, didn't have to pay for anything, pulled my car in. I still had my equipment in the car, and I locked it. And then I went to South Street, which is about 6 blocks away. Well, I got about halfway there. No, I'm sorry, I actually got there. I remember now, because I was ordering pizza. I'd gone to this place to order some pizza, and I was going to take it back to the hotel. That's how this all started. And so it was about 6:30, and it was getting a little bit dark. Must have been fall. I start heading back. When I was about to, well, I'm sorry, I got to back up, because I was paying for the pizza, and the whole reason why I ran back to my car was because I didn't have my wallet. I almost forgot, yeah. I didn't have my wallet, so I looked at the guy and I thought, how could I come out here with my wallet? Well, I remembered I just put everything in the car, and I'd locked it up. I had my key. So I said, I'll be right back. It's about 6 blocks. I walked back. I just turned the corner of my street, and I saw my car driving off. No, I'm not kidding. I saw my car leaving my spot where I had parked, driving away, and I chased the guy down. I said, wait a minute, hey, what do you think you're doing? And I was screaming at the top of my lungs, and the guy looked out the window, the one that was in the passenger seat, flipped me off, and then sped around the corner. I freaked out. I looked, and there was the spot. It was not, I mean, my car had been taken. I went to the police guy, the police officer who was doing pedestrian traffic there in South Street. I said, officer, you've got to help me. My car was just stolen. And I was trying to stay calm. And he said, I said, sir, can you tell me what your car looked like? I said, yeah, it was a Nissan Altima. I had rented it. It was black. I just saw that the guy was mocking me. He drove off and flipped me off, and he was driving off. They took my car, and he said, do you have any ID? And I said, no, it's in the car. He said, well, then is there some way you can call someone? And again, I reached for my pocket. My phone was in the car. My instruments were in the car. The more he asked me questions, the more I began to panic, until he walked with me over there after he got another police officer to take his place, and sure enough, the car was gone. They put out an APB. They put out all sorts of other things. He eventually took me to a hotel. I was just falling apart. My tickets for my flight back, everything was in the car. You know where this is going, right? Right? It only took a day and a half of my drama and the hostess that had brought me there to take me back to where my car was stolen, looked at that spot and said, Tom, this was the next day, afternoon, did you know that every street along this 6-block area looks exactly alike? Took me around to the next block, and there was my car. I had to go back to the police station to tell them to call off the whole thing. I mean, they were having so much fun with me. Like, are all Texans like this? I would much rather react to the extreme than I would to stop. It just seems too easy to go overboard, to react to the negative. And a lot of that comes natural for us in a lot of different places, whether we're at our job and the bickerings going on in our workspace and the little alliances set up, and it's all patterns that have been established and we fall into it so easily. It's so hard to step back, to be present, and to witness to what's possible as opposed to what we've already made up our mind about. But I think that's what's happening here. You know, Einstein said this quote, and some of you all know this, one of my favorite quotes, and again, it doesn't help me a whole lot, but it's one of my favorite. You can't solve a problem with the same way of thinking that got you into that problem. So in terms of resurrection, what does that mean? How do we find it? Because it's too easy for us to always go back to the way things are. To go back to fishing out in the lake like fishermen instead of being disciples. To go back to being negative on Monday morning after being inspired on Sunday. To go back to everything as usual after celebrating Easter with such emotion and beauty. And everything's back to normal. It's so easy. How do we find resurrection. So on my headstone, and hopefully on my heart, and you can remind me of this. I'll freely accept it if you go, are you practicing that, what you preached the other day? Are you practicing that? The destination in life is not a place or a belief. It's being open to a new way of seeing things. In every moment, it's being open. And in that way, God might just be able to break in a little bit. Amen.